Innovation is not about ideas or how you have them or divergent thinking or anything like that. Nobody cares what your ideas are. They care if you can solve problems. So one of the things I always advise clients is, don't look for a great idea. Look for a good problem you can solve.
Hello, I'm Bill Murphy, your host of the Red Zone podcast. I hope you like this introduction with Greg Satell, who I'll tell you more about in a moment. And the reason I like that particular quote of his, no one cares about your ideas, but if you can solve problems. I think that's really interesting. And Greg is sort of like, my conversation with him is sort of like mental judo. And I think with innovation and transformation, we need to be continually greasing the skids in our brain, those neural pathways for looking at solving problems in a different way. So before I transition into more about Greg, a couple things came up for me that I'm not sure if I wanted to share, but I'm going to, because I figured if I'm nervous to share it, I should share it. And many of you know that I came back from Scotland at a really powerful conference that was not easy. It was on the edge of my business comfort for sure. And a big chunk of it was about being accountable for your goals for yourself. And when you're at the top of the food chain, as I am within my company, there's nobody to be, you're not accountable to anybody. I don't have investors or anybody. I'm just accountable to myself, but not to anybody else. And that's both the good and the bad. And to have breakthroughs, I chose that I need to have someone to be accountable to. And literally, I am accountable for this every single week. By Sunday, I have to submit my results in a ton of different categories. And if I miss 3 in a row, I'm tossed out of the program, just gone. And there's very little slack. And other than my death or dismemberment, there's just no excuse that is acceptable. And that's pretty harsh, but that is the type of accountability that high performers have of themselves. And we see that exemplified in different disciplines like arts and sports and in high performers in different fields. But when we talk about you as the digital transformation leader, you as the entrepreneur, you as the business leader, I want to challenge you to think about who you're accountable to and what you're accountable to. And do you actually track your goals? I mean, I've been stunned. I've been having to track my time, which I've been very, very resistant to. And, anybody that sort of brags about having 50, 60, 70 hour, 100 hour work weeks, you really, really gotta pay attention to really how difficult it is to get work done, to actually track those hours that are actual work. Not the windshield time of driving into work, but like actually working and producing a result. It's pretty stunning. And it's actually kind of really impacting my family as I assign things to my kids to do and seeing jobs that I've assigned for them to do, chores, and seeing them half completed. And, as an employer, I wonder often how people grow up not being accountable for the jobs they do. And just, it starts as a kid. And as it starts when you're small, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So it's making me go back and really sit there and go, have I assigned something for my kids? Have they actually completed it? And what type of a son, what type of a daughter am I turning out into the workforce someday? So anyway, that's a little bit about what I see about accountability, and it does link into some of these concepts of innovation that I'm going to be talking about. So Greg, when I talked to Greg, he's a popular writer and speaker and an innovation advisor. And I actually met him through a person who introduced me to Eric Haller and Barry Libinson, who are part of the innovation group at Experian, who I've had on the program. One was the CIO and the other was in charge of the actual innovation lab, Eric. And so it's funny when kind of birds of a feather flock together. And so Greg and I, when we set up this conversation, he had just released his first book, Mapping Innovation, a playbook for navigating a disruptive age. And this is something I want to pay attention to because we want to move out of just having ideas pop into our head about innovation. We want to actually look at ways to actually map it, create a framework for it. And so my conversation with him, he offers a very refreshing perspective on innovation, largely because of his concept of this matrix, which he's created, a framework for helping companies frame problems so they can come up with the right approach to solve them. I do like this approach because it's one thing for one little unit. Oh, this is fascinating too, because there's different approaches to innovation. Some, like Apple, we talk about this. Tim Cook wants to create an organization of innovators, and which contrasts with Google, which has its own labs it's set up. And yes, Google does encourage people to spend 20% of their time with new ideas and such. But the whole point here is which is right for you, which is right for your organization. So it makes me wonder, what are some of the myths of innovation? So Greg and I get into what are just some of the destructive innovation myths. And in this digital innovation age, what is different from preceding generations? And so this is a fascinating conversation I have with Greg, and I encourage you all to go to the show notes at redzonetech.net/podcasts. Greg's made a free download of his first chapter available, and there's links to it on the show notes page. And I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. And so right now I'd like to turn it over, and please let me know how you enjoy this. You can go to my LinkedIn. Please let me know. Also, there's links to Greg as well. Let him know how you enjoy this conversation, and go check out his book as well on Amazon. So with that, let's get into my discussion with Greg Satell. Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of exponential technologies, business innovation, entrepreneurship, thought leadership, enterprise IT security, neuroscience, philosophy, personal development, and more. Welcome to the show. Welcome you to the show today.
Happy to be here, Bill.
So let's talk about yourself and innovation. And I want to give our audience a chance to see, how long have you been in this field of innovation? Like what was the genesis for you, and what has brought you to the point you're at today?
What I was doing for most of my career was running media companies internationally. So I got very good kind of jumping into new markets, learning the culture, learning the language, and figuring out how to build a business. And the reason why I got good at that, what enabled me to do that well, was I built systems for everything. Systems for sales, systems for marketing, systems for operations, for editorial. And wherever I went, I could pretty much implement those systems with some modifications, of course. The one thing I could never build a system for was innovation. And that always really bothered me, because whenever I had to innovate in my business, which was always, there was a lot of good ideas about innovation, Clayton Christensen and disruptive innovation and open innovation and design thinking and lean launch pads and all these things. But whenever you tried to figure something out, it was always someone championing one approach or another. There was never a good framework. I never found one like you have in other fields like marketing or finance. So when the country I was living in blew up and I had to find other things to do, I started talking to pretty much every great innovator I could find, whether that was in a major corporation, in a world-class lab, or at a startup. And what I found is that innovation is really about solving problems. And there are as many ways to innovate as there are different types of problems to solve. So what I did is I built this framework for classifying problems that help you match the right solution to the right problems, instead of trying to jam any problem you come up against into whatever solution set you had pre-chosen. And I also saw that that's where businesses tended to get into a lot of trouble, when they said, this is the way we innovate, or this is our DNA, and we're going to tackle every problem the same way because Clayton Christensen wrote it or because that's how we solved the last problem. You really need to make the solutions fit the problems. So that's what I eventually came up with, and that's what my book's about.
So I'm always curious about this. Is innovation, so you're saying that you can bring some rigor to it via a framework, and is it because serendipity is not as dependable as a framework, or what did you see? What prompted you to think that you needed to have more structure? When I think of framework, I think of more of a structured process. Is that true?
Well, I think there's plenty of structured processes. Even disruptive innovation is somewhat of a structured process. Lean startup methodologies are a structured process. It wasn't so much bringing more process to it. It's more just the realization that there's a lot of really good ideas about innovation around. They've just never been organized in any particular way. So it's, should you do the Clayton Christensen framework, or should you do what Steve Blank says? Or should you, I'll give you a really good example. Recently, Tim Cook, I think it was a year or two ago, he was asked how Apple innovates. And he says, well, what we really do is we push innovation throughout our organization and make everybody accountable for creativity and innovation. And he said, what you really have to watch out for is assigning some kind of vice president of innovation or building some kind of innovation division. Once you do that, you might as well just put a for sale sign on the door. Okay, so, Tim Cook's a really smart guy. He runs an absolutely fabulous business, tremendously successful, and what he says makes a lot of sense. And then you go across town to Google, and they're piling resources into Google X, which is a innovation division to identify technologies that can be 10 times improvement over what we have now. So who do you listen to? Do you listen to Tim Cook, or do you listen to Google? Or maybe neither of them, because Apple hasn't had a hit product since 2007 and Google even longer than that. So what do you do? It's really, really confusing. And that's what really drove me to sort of organize it and figure it out, how you can go and listen to people like Tim Cook, who's obviously been very successful, and how you can listen to Google, who's doing the exact opposite of what he says, and still get some use out of it. And what became clear is that Google and Apple, they're both attacking very, very different types of problems. And then it all makes sense. Well, they're choosing different solutions because they're choosing different problems.
So let's talk about a couple pieces from your book that I thought were really interesting that I wanted you to build upon. And I think this builds upon how people are approaching this from different ways. Is that what I think the word probably innovation might be somewhat. Maybe
it's become kind of a bad word. It's become synonymous with impractical and sort of quixotic.
Yeah, but I agree with you. And maybe we'll come back. I wanted you to define it in a moment. But one of the things that sometimes I think about innovation is if a customer is willing you to pay for something brand new, then you've got something that's innovative. But if it's not, if a customer won't pay you for it, then is that truly innovative? But then I've always had sort of that black and white perspective on it.
Then the problem with that type of approach is, it's a perfectly valid approach in some contexts. But then again, that sort of means that Einstein wasn't innovative, and that just doesn't seem right.
Yeah, and you brought that up in the book because you talked about even with the computer, you kind of reverse engineered who were the founding fathers really of the computer. You went all the way back to John van Neumann and Vannevar Bush, and then it's like ideas kept on building upon ideas, and Kevin Kelly talks about this as well. Really we're building upon thinking from John van Neumann and Vannevar Bush to the Mac to the Alto, invention of the Alto, all the way through where we are today. And so when you're in an enterprise, do you find that can someone innovative thinking that's really just building upon an idea yet it hasn't made it to market yet?
Everybody's always building on people that come before. Everybody's trying to do something new, but you can't do something completely new without building on something that came before, or you're just not going to build anything particularly good. even now we're sort of at a crossroads because we have Moore's Law blowing up, right? I mean, Moore's Law is going to end in, some people say 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever it is. It's not very long because there's only so many transistors you can fit onto a silicon wafer before quantum effects start shorting everything out. So there's a bunch of new ideas out there. Some of it has to do with materials like nanotubes or photonics. Others have to do with quantum computing. And in my book, one of the great joys I had was talking to Charlie Bennett. He's one of the fathers of quantum information. And then you have different ideas like neuromorphic chips or 3D stacking to eliminate the von Neumann bottleneck. There's all these ideas. But even those, when you actually talk to the people who had those ideas, you find that they're actually standing on the shoulders of giants, but just giants in a different field.
When you say different field, you mean outside the computer field or from a different discipline?
Yeah, different discipline. They're sort of crossing domains. And that's how most of the really breakthrough ideas come. There was even a study done recently that most of the really highly cited scientific papers come from a bunch of guys working in a particular field who grabbed one guy working in a completely different field who helped them see things in a new way. But if you look at neuromorphic chips, like the True North chip out of IBM, I talked to the man who led the development of that, jumped right in on. He talked to neuroscientists. He looked at network theory. So an idea always comes from somewhere. You're never starting completely from scratch.
What do you think is the biggest myth or destructive idea about innovation that you see within organizations right now? Or what do you see as people being hung up on?
I would say there's two. The first is that there's one true path to innovation. That tends to take you in really bad ways. Usually people get locked into something because it's been successful in the past, but eventually, and they get convinced that's the one right way to do it. But eventually, as I like to say, every square business meets its round whole world. So once you get locked into a particular set of strategies because you think that's the one right way to do it, chances are you're opening yourself up to getting disrupted. So you always want to keep a wide lens. The other really, I would say, harmful myth is that innovation is about ideas. It's about creativity and having ideas. And that is just not true. Innovation is not about ideas or how you have them or divergent thinking or anything like that. Nobody cares what your ideas are. They care if you can solve problems. So one of the things I always advise clients is, don't look for a great idea. Look for a good problem you can solve.
Oh, that's really interesting. So it really comes down to, building upon the problem. So is it more important to ask a better question?
No. What's a better question? I hear that a lot too. How do you know what a better question is? At the end of the book, I put in some sort of concluding findings and about what great innovators had in common. And the one chief thing I noticed above all is that it wasn't about how they solved problems. It wasn't about how creative they were or how smart they were or whether they were agile or what kind of organization they had or anything like that. The one thing that every great innovator that I studied, and I looked at dozens, was that they had a systematic and disciplined process for identifying new problems to solve. So just to give you some examples, so Experian Data Labs, that's its only mission. It doesn't have a P&L. It doesn't have a revenue target. They're just supposed to go to customers and find out what kind of problems they're having with data. And then they try and solve them. And usually they can come back with a prototype within 90 days. And if the client likes the solution, they co-create it and eventually they make it into a business. And that's really become like an engine of growth for Experian. Now, you look at IBM. IBM is a big, slow, bureaucratic company. Not at all the type of organization you'd associate with great innovation. And everybody says, IBM's a dinosaur, their technology's old, and so on and so forth. 99% of the people who have ever said that are long out of business, because somehow IBM finds a way to continually reinvent itself about once every 20 years. They were a tabulating company, and then they got absolutely disrupted by digital computing. And then they ended up dominating digital computing. Then they got disrupted by microcomputers and PCs. And then they reinvented the PC market. And then they almost went bankrupt again. But they reinvented themselves as a consulting company. Now they're getting killed by the cloud, because although they're building a cloud business, there's not nearly as much money in cloud as they had in installed solutions. So they're reinventing themselves again. And Watson's a big part of that. So how do they keep doing that? Well, they have this huge research division that's continually looking for new problems to solve. And they also have a tradition that they call grand challenges, which is just they're trying to go and solve a problem just to see if it can be solved, just to stretch the organization. The last one was the Jeopardy Grand Challenge, where without any kind of business application in mind, they just wanted to see if they could beat humans at Jeopardy. And now that's become Watson. It's become an engine of growth for their business. But you see the difference. I mean, Experian's looking for problems they can solve within 90 days. IBM's looking for problems that will take them years or even decades to solve, which is something you can do when you have a research division with more Nobel Prize winners than most countries have. So the way they approach problems is completely different. The similarity there is that they're constantly looking for new problems to solve.
So if a company, like a legacy organization that knows that it needs to start being innovative, essentially what you're saying is one of the ways to start is by...
You have to prepare. I mean, like I said, every business is a square hole business waiting for its round hole world. So you have to, it's much more important to prepare than it is to adapt. Once you adapt, you're already losing. Once you find you're adapting, I mean, that's a necessity once it gets to the point that you have to adapt. I mean, nobody ever talks about Apple adapting to the mobile world or Google adapting to search engines. And actually, when both companies have had to adapt, they tend to do it quite poorly. I mean, both have had a lot of misses when they were playing catch up. So what you really want to do is go out and look for what kind of problem can you solve. And if you can keep searching out for new problems to solve, it doesn't mean that you're going to get all of them solved. But as long as you can continually find new problems, one a year, one every 5 years, depending on how big the problem is, you can pretty much guarantee that you'll be able to sustain your business. What you have to watch out for is looking at your business and saying, oh, this is great. We have this square peg business. We're building more pegs for more holes, better, faster, cheaper. And then one day waking up and find out that you're getting better and better at a bunch of things that people care less and less about, because that's when you end up getting your business into a ton of trouble. And anybody who's been in business for any length of time has seen that happen. Like if you look at Intel now, they're in really a bad spot with the shift to graphical processors. Nobody really saw that coming. Just some guy said, hey, if we use graphical processors, we could do artificial intelligence a lot better.
Machine learning, yeah.
Machine learning, artificial intelligence, whatever you want to call it. NVIDIA didn't invent that. They were just sort of in the right place at the right time. And there's a lot of other different approaches that might soon eclipse the GPUs. And NVIDIA's will be in the same position that Intel is now. That happens to everybody. It's unavoidable because every business, to a certain extent, is a series of coin flips. You try and narrow down to a couple of viable options, but at the end of the day, you have to take a chance between one or two or three or whatever it is. And at some point, you're going to be wrong. I mean, Intel, they got the coin flips right for 40 years, but eventually it caught up to them. So I think when you talk about innovation, I would more look at it as, what are we doing to prepare for when the way we make money now becomes irrelevant?
When the way we make money becomes irrelevant, what are we doing now to prepare for that?
Yeah,
And
it's going to happen. It happens to every business, no matter how smart or fast or creative you are. Eventually, you're going to miss a trick. Everybody does. You can't get every coin flip right for the rest of your life. So it's just an unreasonable expectation. So what can you do now? And it's a lot cheaper to do it now. I mean, that's another myth, I would say, about innovation, that you have to go out and really swing for the fences or take big risks. You don't have to take huge risks. You just need to make some small bets early and continually search for new problems. And like I said, they do it all different types of ways. I gave the example of Experian and IBM. Google, their 20% time program is really just in some sense, a human-powered search engine for new problems. Steve Jobs didn't look for great ideas. He looked for things that sucked. Music players sucked. Let's go and make them great. Mobile phones, they suck. Let's go and make them great. So it doesn't really matter how you go about it, just that you make sure that you're continually searching for new problems outside of your current line of business that you can solve.
Does it just have to come from the top, or does it have, and I don't mean that in a cliche way that everything has to come from the top, but like, where do you see the biggest impact being within an organization, from the CFO, COO, VP of sales, and across the, to the CIO? Where are you seeing innovation predominantly residing that are having the biggest impact with organizations? And not just like the traditional technology companies, but like East Coast companies or Central America companies that are substantial, but they need to sort of embrace this more deeply.
I'd say it really does have to come from the top.
Okay.
Because searching isn't very efficient. Right? When you're searching for new business models or new technologies or new problems to solve, whatever it is kind of a serendipitous process. I mean, it averages out to a pretty sure thing in the end, but it's not like an optimization type of thing like Six Sigma would do well. So if you have the view from the top that our job is to make our square peg business ever more efficient, then it's really, really going to be hard for that searching to happen unless the people at the top understand that, look, we need a certain amount of inefficiency. We need to go out and search because that's an investment in the future. We don't know which one of these small bets are going to pay off, but the odds are that just like you can't get every coin flip right, you're not going to strike out every single time you're at bat. And there's certain companies that really understand that, and there's certain companies that don't, and they say, no, we just want to make everything we do more efficient. And those are the ones who eventually get stuck in the situation where they're getting better and better at things that people care about less and less.
And that's your point about that innovation isn't necessarily innovating on the core to make things more efficient, to your point, but it's actually inventing the new.
Well, again, let's get back to how you define innovation. There's lots of definitions out there. The way I like to define it is it's a novel solution to an important problem. So some people call sustaining innovation incremental innovation, and they're very derisive about it. But that's Moore's Law. Moore's Law is incremental innovation. That's what's powered the digital revolution. Most of your value is going to come from incremental innovations. The formula that Google and other people use and that I write about in my book is 70-20-10, where 70% should go towards sustaining innovations, 20% towards adjacencies, and 10% of resources to kind of blue sky opportunities. And that's, as long as you don't take that framework too seriously, it's pretty good. Those ratios don't have to be exact. But the bulk of your resources should be getting better at doing what you're doing now. But then you also need to set aside some resources for exploring new things, adjacent markets, adjacent capabilities, and also to invent things that haven't been invented yet. Even if you can't define, either the skills or what the problem is. So I think it's more about building up a portfolio of strategies rather than saying this one right here, that's the horse we're going to ride on from now until eternity.
What is a tool to frame a problem? What do you mean by that? Is one of the outcomes from the book you mentioned is that have a tool to frame it. What is that, and why is that important?
Well, the main framework in the book is called the innovation matrix, and that is you just ask two very simple questions: how well is the problem defined, and then how well is the domain defined? And what you find is that tends to break out problems very, very well. There's some others that I write about in the book. One is called a 3 horizons model, where you break things out into existing markets and existing capabilities, and then adjacent markets, adjacent capabilities, new markets, new capabilities. So those are two that I think are very useful. On a more practical level, 2 questions that you can use, on just a very, very granular level. Do we have a technical specification for this? And do we have a job description for this? And once you start asking these questions, you'll see, okay, we're dealing with very, very different problems, and they require very, very different approaches. And then I explain in the book how you can match those different types of problems with solutions best fit to solve them. For instance, problems that are very well defined but seem to defy a solution. Those are problems that tend to do pretty well with open innovation strategies because you need to iterate the solution spaces. And usually what you find is what's very, very difficult in one field can be solved very easily in an adjacent field. Other times you have pretty well-defined solutions, but it's not clear what the problem is. So you need to iterate the problem spaces. And that's what things like lean startup methodologies and minimal viable products and customer development do really well. And you can see, businesses like Uber and Airbnb, they took pretty standard solutions. There was nothing really special about the solution they devised. The genius was that they applied it to a completely new problem. And obviously they built great businesses doing that.
Well, and the funny thing is that who had the resources to actually invent this alternative to Airbnb, but Hyatt or Marriott, but it didn't come from them. And same thing with Uber, it didn't come from the taxi cab industry. So how is it necessary to set up your innovation lab, so to speak, outside of the organization so that it can think independently? What is your thoughts on that?
Well, again, innovation labs have been taking a beating lately because so many of them fail. And again, it's about applying them to the right problem. Innovation labs are very good in this disruptive innovation space where you're trying to find new problems for existing solutions. When I was out talking to Eric Haller at Experian Labs, I said, you're not really trying to find solutions for problems. What you're really trying to do is find problems for solutions that you already have. And he said, yeah, that's true. I never really thought of it that way. When an innovation lab is targeted at finding new problems for solutions that exist within the organization, they tend to do pretty well. The problem with innovation labs is they're quite often used to go out and solve really hard problems or as some kind of panacea for innovation as a whole. And, when you pick the right solution for the wrong problem, things tend not to go very well. Does that make sense? Or
it does.
Have I lost you?
No. It makes sense. And again, the Experian the leaders of Experian have been on the show, and so they have this treasure trove of data that already exists, and they can hunt for
and algorithms and people with specific skills. They've got great data scientists. They have a pretty good idea what their capabilities are. What makes it successful is they go out and find the problem and uncover the problems to solve. But back to your question about Marriott and Hyatt and people like that, there's no reason they should have come up with Airbnb. And if you look at Airbnb, what the total market is for, it wouldn't support a business like Marriott or Hyatt. Wouldn't even come close. I was looking at the numbers recently, but it's like less than 0.5% of the total hospitality market. So, you're talking about these companies with huge shares. So why would they want to do an Airbnb? I mean, it's a great business for a startup and for their investors. I'm not sure it would be such a great business for Marriott, who have, much different capabilities. They know how to, for instance, cater to business travelers. So the question for Marriott or Hyatt isn't how do we make our own Airbnb, but how can we extend our own assets or our own capabilities into new markets or improve them, or to go out and build a new capability that nobody else could ever build. So I think whenever a new disruptive competitor comes up, they say, oh, why didn't somebody see that? Why didn't Marriott see that? Well, Marriott has no reason to see it.
Yeah, they do have no reason to see it. And I think from some of the information and some of the slide decks I see is Airbnb's valuation is essentially greater than Hyatt's right now, and they have no assets, so they don't own any real estate. So does that mean that Hyatt's business is threatened by Airbnb, or is it just another? So I think that's where it's coming from, is should the hotel industry have innovated there and kind of transformed themselves? But that's frightening probably for the hotel industry. And I mean, in my industry, in the technology space, I was meeting with a company, a $100 million company the other day in my own industry, and they're frightened because they are constantly selling hardware and software solutions on premise to large companies. And now these large companies are moving to the cloud, and that's disrupting them. And the alternative, so they're used to these big hardware software hits of revenue, and they're frustrated because now they have to invent a new business model that's going to seem not very profitable. So you explain managed services to them, and there's not these big cocaine hits of gross profit that hits the bottom line anymore. But they have a choice. They either die or they build a new business model. But you can see the fear on their face as they have to approach this and deal with this new reality.
Well, that's exactly the problem IBM has now. I mean, that's exactly the problem. I mean, they built a business on installed solutions, and they've moved to the cloud, but the cloud isn't nearly as profitable as those installed solutions. So that's why they're doing things like Watson and quantum computing. And I mean, IBM, the good thing about IBM is, with their research division, usually when their business starts failing, they've, had something in the cooker for 20 years. So
yeah, right.
Not everybody has that. Watson, I think the Jeopardy Grand Challenge started 2004 or 5 or something, I think. And, it's just becoming a business now. And they're trying to grow their new businesses as fast as their old ones are dying. But, I haven't really looked at the hotel industry in any depth, but I have been looking at the retail industry. And it's really interesting because retailers, they say they're getting killed by e-commerce. And then you look at the numbers and you say, okay, well, e-commerce as a whole is, I think 8.5% of total retail now. And at the same time, you see all of these e-commerce players building brick and mortar shops. So obviously retail can't be dead if the e-commerce guys are rushing to get into it. I mean, Apple, Amazon, Bonobos, Warby Parker. The real issue is, and again, back to this square peg business, round peg world thing, is that retail locations, historically, their main function has been to drive transactions. And that's how their metrics have been built, with sales per square foot and average transaction and so on and so forth. And that's what their organizations have been built to solve. But now the problem has shifted because transactions can happen anywhere. They can happen on a mobile phone. You can do it, you can buy stuff while you're waiting for your dry cleaning. So the function of a retail location has really shifted to being able to learn more about products, to go to a showroom, to be able to ask questions, to get serviced,
sure,
to upsell, to do all those things. So when you look at it in retail, the problem isn't that e-commerce is killing them or anything like that. The problem is they're trying to do what they've done traditionally better and better, where the problem the customer wants solved has completely changed.
Sure.
They want, when you go to a store, you want a high touch, high service experience. You want someone servicing you who really knows what they're talking about, and you're not just being driven to a cash register. And I'd say the hotel problem is probably very similar. What Airbnb has found another way to solve I need a roof over my head problem. So if you're in the hotel business and you're saying, oh, our job is to put roofs over people's heads, well, chances are you're not going to make it, because Airbnb can do that much more efficiently than you can.
Right.
Yeah. But there's a lot of other things hotels do, like events, like restaurants, like having a concierge there to take care of problems for you. So there's lots of things that hotels can do that Airbnb can. The real challenge, I think, is to say, okay, how can we either build a new capability that nobody else can, or how do we take our existing capabilities and apply them to a new market?
Right. And one of the pieces that I think I'm hearing a lot as far as new capabilities, which frightens the heck out of people because they're inventing something that doesn't necessarily exist, or they can't see it tangibly existing, is you have a part of your book in your process called Leveraging Platforms to Access Ecosystems. And I'm trying to give people some carrots here of how they can actually get these initiatives matured within their organizations and build them out. And could you explain a little bit more about how, what do people do to access talent, resources, ideas, capabilities at pace and at speed? Like, how would you recommend people do that?
Well, I think it's very simple. You have to look, in my mind, you have to look at technology as extending your own capabilities. And these days, because we are so much more connected than we used to be, you really can't compete on your own internal resources alone. So I think every single resource, whether it's, and the three pillars are talent, technology, and information, you have to say, okay, here are internal resources, but what platforms can we use to extend those capabilities? Linux was a great example where Microsoft said Linux is a cancer, but IBM said, hey, this is great. We never made money on operating systems anyway. We can just use that to extend and put those resources elsewhere. These days, in terms of talent, there's a number of great platforms, whether some of the ones I wrote about in my book were Elance, which is very now Upwork.
Yep. Now Upwork.
Yeah, which is a very, very interesting story. Actually, I want to spend, we don't have much time left, but I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about that in terms of what makes platforms work and not work. So Elance started as basically a matching service, very much like Monster.com, to match companies to freelance contractors. And so they launched it, and it was an absolute disaster, got no traction at all. So the investors brought in a new CEO to pursue a completely different business model, which is called vendor management software.
Oh, interesting.
And what they did is they went to a big company like GE and say, look, you've got thousands of these contractors running around. You don't have any way of organizing them, what the agreement for work is, what the rates are. Not only have you not organized it, you don't even know what it is, because you've got thousands upon thousands of contracts all over the world. So we're going to make so use this software, and this software will give you visibility and help you manage all those vendors. It did really, really well. Matter of fact, it did so well, it started to attract the likes of SAP and Oracle into the business. So they said, well, we're probably not going to survive, right? Because the jig is up. So they ended up selling the business to another company who was then bought by IBM, I think. But they said, hey, let's keep our brand. Let's keep some of the intellectual property that we built, and let's keep some of our best people. And let's go and revisit that original idea with all that we've learned from the vendor management software, and not just to try and make matches, but also to help make those engagements successful. And that combination ended up being obviously a big success. And they built on top of it things like partnerships with training companies so that they could train and accredit people in new skills. So if you're a Flash programmer and all of a sudden demand for your services is dropping because of HTML5, you can get trained and certified in HTML5 and still be able to get work. And then that built into new things, like companies started coming to them, like Microsoft with SharePoint, saying, hey, we've got the SharePoint thing. We need a bunch of people certified in it so that we can, sell and our customers can be confident that they can get their software serviced and designed. So they also built things called private clouds. So it ended up becoming this whole platform so that companies could access ecosystems of talent, and also the talent could access ecosystems of employers. And that's kind of what a platform does. It helps ecosystems access each other. Very similar thing on the technology side with open source. So, you never, it's very difficult these days to make money on a standard technology. If you look, Silicon Valley has become really an industry that builds applications on top of communal technologies. It's very difficult to find a technology that's not built on open source these days, which is why now Microsoft, instead of saying Linux is a cancer, they came out a year or so ago saying Microsoft loves Linux. We build all of our stuff on top of this. And also ecosystems of information. And there's a really interesting company called, now I forget their name. Oh, that's embarrassing.
But I do like the ecosystem, and I completely agree. And it's often not really seen as an option with a lot of the people I'm running into, and they've really got to look at it that way. Like I have my podcast produced in Czech Republic. I have had material that I needed advanced talent for machine learning and AI because I don't carry that native talent within my organization, but people I work with needed some innovative solutions. And so we just reached out into the ecosystem in this platform that was able to find this talent. And conversely, I could build that ecosystem myself to extend value upon the services that we're offering. So I love this concept. And Linux is a perfect example, as you mentioned, and Elance now Upwork is, and there's others as well.
Yeah, just one more example now that I remember the name of the company, which is Bloomreach. And they basically have a platform that helps online retailers compete with Amazon. One of the big advantages Amazon has is that they're so big that they have a huge data advantage. But because Bloomreach powers about 20% of the US e-commerce, they allow more traditional retailers like Toys R Us and Crate and Barrel and Neiman Marcus, by pooling their data within the platform, because they all sort of contribute data to their platform, they're able to get that much wider view. So when a customer comes to their website, they're not only looking at their data in the context of what they did last time they were on the website, but in the context of the entire platform.
Well, this has been a blast, Greg, and I know that your book is launching very, very shortly here, called The Mapping Innovation: A Playbook for Navigating a Disruptive Age. And let's talk about where people can find you online and where they can find more information about the book. Clearly, they could go to Amazon, but where can people find you? What's the best place for them to interact with you individually?
The best place is my site, digitaltonto.com. I'm also always accessible through LinkedIn. But if you think I can help your company, just get in touch.
Right. And this is something you offer through these innovation workshops, and
yes,
which you talk more clearly and more deeply about your mapping innovation concepts. So
it's really a very practical step-by-step process about how to build an innovation playbook and prepare for the future.
Well, Greg, this has been a lot of fun, and I know some of the concepts we're talking about today are fresh. And I love the concepts that you've talked about problems, finding problems to solve. I think that is really great. So until next time, Greg, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcasts. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously, and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.